Well, good morning and Happy New Year to you, church. I know our youth got out to a lock-in last night. Kenton made it back from that lock-in, and he stayed awake all through class. I was sure proud of him. Who's to say that that'll happen here at the lesson, though, right? So good to see you. I hope that your holiday time was well spent with family and with friends. I pray that this upcoming year will be a blessing to you as well. Let's turn to the book of Ruth for our scripture reading. Ruth. In your Bibles, right in front of you in the pew, it's page number 327. Ruth chapter 1 is where we'll begin this morning. Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 14, and this is from the New American Standard Bible. And they lift up their voices again and wept. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And then she said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return with your sister-in-law." And Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. This may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." And whenever she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came about that whenever they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" And so Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. I love the book of Ruth. Do you love the book of Ruth? It's just such a wonderful book, and the imagery there is just so vivid. Ruth's name means friend. And so I guess if you are ruthless, then you're friendless, right? The book of Ruth, it's such a contrast from the book that just comes prior to it within the list of the books of the Bible. The book of Judges, I don't know about you, but the book of Judges can just be a depressing book, especially as you get towards the end. And there right after the book of Ruth is just like a fresh air to you. It's a short book. I've often entertained the notion of whenever I have the opportunity to preach the book of Ruth, to just read it in full to you. I've wanted to do that with other books as well. I'm not going to do that to you this morning, but I think that there is just so much here, and it's written so well, and the story just flows kind of like this scene that we just witnessed between Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. The book begins by saying that it happened during the time of the judges, and so we are within that same time period. We know that Ruth's great-grandson is going to become the second king of Israel. David comes from Ruth's lineage. Is that giving away the rest of the story too soon? It kind of has a happy ending there. But there are 5 generations from the time of the land of Canaan being conquested, because Rahab is within that same lineage as well. And so from the conquest of the land of Israel until the time that David is on the throne, there are only 5 generations. You have Salmon marrying Rahab, and guess what their child's name is? It's Boaz. Boaz fits prominently within this story as well. Ruth and Boaz have Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And the reason that I am doing that historically for you is that you have within the judges, you have this family's life, and it's just basically 5 generations for the span of the judges. And so Salmon and Rahab are there at the beginning, at the conquest. David is at the end with the kings, but we're already well into the kings because Saul has been on the throne for 40 years by that time. But what I am saying is that through this period of the judges, it is probably early on, since you have 5 generations that are within the conquest, from the conquest of the land until the time of David. I think that the book of Ruth probably lies somewhere on the beginning half of the book of Judges, is where it lies as chronological, but I can't pinpoint it any further than that. I've tried to pinpoint when the book of Ruth takes place, but other than what it says that it took place during the time of Judges, and I think just basically on the first half of that. But whatever the time period is, it's not a great one with regards to the climate or to the weather. There is a famine within the land, and that starts off Naomi and her family leaving the land of Canaan with her husband Elimelech. Elimelech, his name means God is king. And you can almost hear that. Melech means king. El means God. And so God is king. Mahlon and Chilion, her sons, have a little bit more of a negative connotation to their names' meanings. Mahlon means begging or sickness. Chilion means pining. And then you say, that almost sounds like Mahlon. You might think, well, why in the world would anybody name their children Mahlon and Chilion? Well, maybe it was because that was at the beginning of the famine. And what Naomi is actually doing in naming her children Mahlon and Chilion, perhaps that's the reason that she is actually petitioning God with their names. Naomi's name, it means pleasant. Remember, whenever she gets back, she's not really pleasant whenever she gets back. She says, don't call me pleasant anymore. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Do you know what Mara means? At least Naomi is naming it for what it is. Mara means bitterness or embitterment. And so through this course of the story, we really have almost every kind of personality or character trait or circumstance that we endure in our daily lives. And I think that's why it's so easy for us to identify with the book of Ruth. Have you ever spent time in your life that you initially thought were wasted years? Is there a segment of your life that, at least while you were going through it, you were thinking, I really don't know what it is that I am accomplishing here? And maybe it was during a time of sickness, a trial of some sort. Maybe there was an injury or the loss of a loved one. And you know how easy it is then, if you have spent those years, at least while you were going through them, to feel as though that God was not taking care of you. Here Naomi, whose name means pleasant, who is married to God's king, and they are the people of God, they are the Israelites, they are having to leave Bethlehem, town meaning the house of bread, in order to go somewhere else to find a way to survive. And she is stuck within that foreign country, and in order to live, they have left everything that they know and hold dear, and for 10 years, they have lived within this foreign country. How good has the time been, Naomi? What did she tell us? She says, it hasn't been good at all. My husband died. I became a widow. My children married outside of the Lord. They did, you know. Orpah and Ruth are Moabite women. That was forbidden for an Israelite to marry outside of the Lord, to marry foreign women. I think that probably caused Naomi some consternation as well, that life has just dealt me a bad hand, I think, and she's going to deal with it the best that she can. But then what happens? Her hope for the future dies. Her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die, and she can't even bury them within the land of the Israelites in Bethlehem. And so once that's done, she's done. And she's found that things are a little bit better back within her home country. And so what does Naomi do? She packs up her things and she says goodbye to her daughter-in-law and she dismisses them. And it's not without compassion. There are some hugs and there's some kisses, but she says, you girls go on. You go on with your life. You do what you need to do, because there's no way that I can satisfy your future. And really what Naomi is doing is she's thinking a little bit further down the line, and she's not simply thinking about herself, because she says, even if I married and I had children, would you wait around for those children to become men? And that seems a little bit strange to us. What is she talking about whenever she says that? Well, she's talking about the Levirate law. And the Levirate law said that whenever a man died without having any children, the nearest of kin was to take that widow into their home so that they could raise offspring for that man's inheritance and so that it wouldn't be lost. It's kind of hard for us to imagine Naomi being the one that is speaking about the Levirate law with regards to herself, right? Because we so often see it with Ruth and with Boaz being the redeeming kinsman. But what Naomi is actually saying is, if I went and I had somebody fulfill that law, the brotherly law, that would marry me and then I would have children, would you wait for them to grow up to be your husband? She says, I'm just a little too old for that. I'm over the hill. Things are past all of that. How old do you think Naomi is? You ever try to put an age to her? We don't know for sure, right? But we do know that before they left the land of Canaan, that she has 2 sons that are unmarried before they leave. They probably could have been and probably were adolescents, possibly young men. And so I can't imagine, because they don't marry until they get there. How old would you say Ruth is? I mean, they're out there for 10 years, right? And so would you say that Ruth is more than 30 years old? Girls married at a young age. I'm not saying that Ruth necessarily did herself, but the reason I ask is, how old do you think Naomi is? Is she 50? Is she pushing 60? Oh man, that's old, right? The reason I say that is because although Naomi is not all that old, she feels as though she is, because life has just been so terrible to her. We never get that way, right? And she's ready to throw up her hands, and she says, just change my name, because pleasant is not me anymore. Call me Mara, for I am bitter. Oh, Naomi, do you really feel that way? She says, I left full and I came back empty, and it's the Lord's fault. That's what she said. She says, the Almighty is the one that has afflicted me. She is going back to a town, though, that means the house of bread, because she has heard that things are good again. But as she is going back, she's going back with a less than perfect attitude, isn't she? And so as she's ready to dismiss those daughter-in-law, she says, I can't expect you to wait around for sons of mine. You girls just go on home. And she says, to your family and to your God. Do you know who the God of the Moabites was? We're not told this within the book of Ruth, but if you would like to look in Numbers chapter 21 and verse 29, and also within the book of Judges, the God of the Moabites is dealt with Jephthah whenever he says, don't you take that land that Chemosh gives you. And in the process of that statement, he identifies who the God of the Amorites is, and also, or the Ammonites, and also as well the God of the Moabites. We actually have historical record of this as well, and not just scriptural record. But his name was Chemosh, Chemosh. And Chemosh, like all the Baals, because he was associated with the Baals, was a god of fertility. He was a god of produce. It just so happens to be that he was worshipped on the eastern side of the Jordan River, because that's where the Ammonites and the Moabites lived. And Chemosh is identified in the book of Jeremiah, also in the book of Judges, and in the book of Numbers as being the god of the Moabites. Why wouldn't Ruth be happy with a god that was her own people's? Could it be that she knew too much? I think so. She has been married for 10 years to an Israelite, and she has been within the household of a mother-in-law who is an Israelite. And in the process of those 10 years, though her husband has died, Ruth has become a convert to Jehovah. Not so much that Naomi feels that it's something that she needs to continue in. She says, you just girls go on back home to your family and to your God. And Ruth says, no, Here's kind of the oddity within this lesson. Here is Naomi, an Israelite, who knows Jehovah and is blaming him. He has returned me empty, and she is embittered towards God, although there is a glimmer of hope here as she has turned back to Bethlehem and to return. But Ruth, here, a Moabite, a foreigner, is embracing Jehovah. She has proselytized. She has become, within her own mind, I believe, a convert to Jehovah. Your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people. Don't turn me back. And do you know why? Because Chemosh is a Baal god, was not a god of sexual purity. It is at Baal Peor that Moses wrestles with the God of the Moabites. That is Chemosh at Baal Peor, where God was distraught with the people before they ever even came into the land of Canaan. Remember, it was at Baal Peor, which is the mountain peak that identifies the location in which it was. The incident at Baal Peor with Balaam and Balak and all of that, that was the god Chemosh. Why would you not want to glory in a god that promotes sexual promiscuity and prostitution within it? Did you know that he was also a god that demanded human sacrifice? Ruth doesn't want to have anything to do with that. She says, your God will be my God. I don't want what my kinsmen have. I don't want what this land represents. Does Ruth have hope? Oh man, she has all the hope in the world. She is a direct contrast, not simply between old and young, but between embittered and hopeful. Remember what her name means. It means friend. Well, who is she a friend to? Naomi's going to find out that she is her best of friends, but also Ruth, and this is the title of my lesson for this morning, Ruth is a friend of God. Ruth knows that she has found the truth. And so she pledges. Have you ever pledged your love? Maybe you even use this within your wedding. Whether thou goest, I will go, and whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. What a wonderful pledge here that Ruth is making towards Naomi. And basically, when Naomi hears it, she throws up her hands. It says that when she saw that she was determined, and basically she said that she relented. This girl is going with me. You ever had one of those children that you tell them to get on back to the house, and before you know it, they're right there at your feet again? That's Ruth, isn't it? She's there, and she says, don't tell me to go back. Why? Well, her husband is dead, and if you want to know which of the two that she was married to, go to chapter 4 and verse 10, and you'll find out that Mahlon was her husband. She was married to Mahlon, and she is now, though, renewing the pledge that she had made to Mahlon. To who? To her mother-in-law. Ladies, do you feel this way about your mother-in-law? You don't have to answer that. And in the process, she understands that obligation is transferable, doesn't she? Is she really under obligation to take care of her mother-in-law? Well, in Ruth's mind, yes, because Ruth sees her mother-in-law as a widow that's in need. Oh, wait a minute. Ruth is a widow. She ought to be the one that's experiencing the Levirate law, right? And that's going to come later on within the book. But what is Ruth? She is willing to pledge her love and to sacrifice herself. Her individuality at this point has vacated the premises, and as she clings to her mother-in-law and she makes this pledge, she is pledging not only her love, but her family and her culture and her religion and perhaps even her language. I just assume that the Moabites don't speak Hebrew, but I guess I'm not exactly sure of that. But what Ruth is saying as she pledges her love is everything that I know, these surroundings, this town, this landscape, this side of the Jordan, it's all for naught. I walk with you because where you're going, I am going to go. Did you ever do that? You ever make a pledge like that to set aside your own passions and desires and to give yourself to somebody else? You did if you have been married or if you are married, didn't you? In fact, you made that pledge if you were ever in the military, didn't you? You made that pledge if you were ever on the mission field. You said, I sacrifice that which is rightfully mine so that I might give myself in service to another or to a cause or to the country. But this is coming from a heathen. This pledge and this association with self-sacrifice is coming from somebody that shouldn't know any better. Think about her God. I mean, sexual promiscuity and human sacrifice, and yet here she is with her widowed mother-in-law, dedicating herself to walk into a strange land and amongst a strange people. Identity? Oh, Ruth, you don't have one anymore. But who's bitter? It's not Ruth, because after that pledge and after the sacrificing her individuality, she understands that that commitment requires for her to walk with the one that she has made that pledge unto. And so I can just imagine that scene as Ruth and Naomi make their way back and they come up to the Jordan. Possibly Ruth has never crossed the Jordan from the east side over into the west side into the land of Canaan before. But I just want you to picture her as she stands there on the border and looking into the land. What do you think she thought? Do you think she had any misgivings whatsoever? I don't think she had any second thoughts. She is with Naomi, and her job is to take care of her mother-in-law. And so as they cross the Jordan and they come up around the desert places where the city of Jericho lies in ruins because it fell not all that long ago. I guess it would have been about 100 to 150 years prior to the time of Ruth that Jericho would have fallen. But they walk past Jericho and they walk into those hills near Jabus, or Jerusalem as it was called before. And then they drop down into the town of Bethlehem, which is just a couple of miles to the south. And as they enter in, there is this excitement because everybody knows Naomi. Evidently, they haven't been gone so long, or Naomi isn't so old that people don't recognize her anymore. But they say, "Is this Naomi?" And they are all excited. Can you imagine this scene as Naomi says, "I have left full, but I came back empty." Think of Ruth. She's standing right there. What has Naomi said? "I left with everything, and I come back with nothing." You think Ruth thought, "What am I? I'm standing right here, Naomi. Am I chopped liver?" But you don't hear a word from her, do you? And as they enter in, there is this excitement, and Ruth is there with her. Do you think that Ruth stood there and said, "Well, why are we here? What am I going to do now?" We don't have Ruth answering in any way. She is just completely absorbed now within the life of Naomi, and she knows that her walk is one of encouragement because she has pledged herself to her mother-in-law, and she, I don't think, has any misgivings whatsoever. Ruth is just such a sweet character within the Bible, isn't she? And as time progresses and reality sets in, Naomi says, "We are going to need something to eat." And who does that burden fall upon? It falls upon Ruth. And so Naomi says to Ruth, "You've got to go out and you've got to glean the fields." That's what the poor people do. That's how the law describes, is it to gather in the remnants of that which is left out. Do you hear Ruth complaining as she goes out into the field? No, Ruth accepts the culture. She accepts the religion because this is what God has said and the way in which she is to provide. And she goes into the field and she begins to glean, and providence takes over, doesn't it? And whose field does she go into? Oh, it's Boaz's field. And she finds there abundance. I mean, Boaz finds out who she is, first of all, and says, "Well, who is she?" And they say, "Oh, well, that's my nearest kinsman." And then he offers her to come in and to have lunch with her. And then he says, "You only glean within my fields." And then he told his servants, he goes, "You make sure that you don't abuse her, and you make sure that she goes home with plenty whenever she leaves." And she does. And Naomi looks at those things that Ruth has brought back from the fields, and she says, "Whoa, whose field did you go to today?" And she might as well have said, "Wow, the stars are smiling upon you." And she says, "I went to the field of Boaz." And Naomi has an epiphany. Ding. Boaz is our nearest kinsman. Don't you go to any other field but his, she says. And she begins to think about something besides herself. And Mara begins to wane, and Naomi begins to blossom again. Do you see it? Isn't that amazing how that can happen if we'll quit thinking about ourselves and start thinking about others? If we'll stop rehearsing our own troubles and instead begin making plans for the betterment of the future of somebody else's hope. You know, that happens to be the secret of life, by the way. That's why Ruth is the way she is. She has forfeited within her mind her future so that she might serve. When we begin to serve others, the drudge of our daily life wanes and the hope of tomorrow begins to blossom. That truly is the secret to life. A friend of God is a friend indeed. Life is better, isn't it, whenever you go through it with a companion? And God is the best of companions. I could wrap it up right there. I'm not going to. You say, I wish you would, but I could stop right there. When Ruth is defined as a friend, she is a friend, but she becomes it because of that transformation that God has made upon her own heart. And then the future just opens up like a panoramic for Ruth. And Naomi begins to steam, and she begins to plan, and Ruth becomes her co-conspirator. I mean, these ladies are having fun, and Boaz has not a clue what hit him. Never been there? Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match. And Naomi says, it's time for the wheat harvest. Tonight, Boaz is going to be down there on the threshing floor, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to clean yourself up real good. By the way, this is your first date, and you're going to get engaged tonight. You're going to go down there, and you are going to lay at Boaz's feet whenever he is sound asleep. And whenever he says to you, whatever he says to you, he'll tell you what you are to do. And so she does just what her mother-in-law, they're on the threshing floor. The woman was not allowed. It was not allowed for a woman to be down there on the threshing floor. But I guess Ruth is just so uncultured. She doesn't know any better. She walks in, and Boaz is asleep there by the grain, and she pulls up the covers and she lays down at his feet. And I guess through the night, he struggles in some way, or he kicks out, and he says, whoa, there's somebody down there. And who is that? And it's Ruth. What are you doing here, Ruth? And she says, my mother-in-law told me to do. And he says, don't you worry about it. I'll take care of it. Now, you need to leave before it becomes light, before the morning. And then whenever it does get light, he says, hold out your robe, and he fills her robe with grain. And then what she has done then is takes that back to Naomi, and Naomi says, it's all going to work out. It's all going to work out. Don't you worry about it, my dear. He is going to work all of these things out. But what has Ruth done? She has just proposed to Boaz. Talk about women's lib, or talk about, women's right. This is coming from this mild Moabite woman, and she has proposed to him. And as far as we know, their age is great in difference. We were trying to identify how old is Naomi and how old is Ruth. The only thing that we hear Boaz saying is, may God be blessed and may you be blessed for having not chose a younger man. And so how old is Boaz? And that's why it's kind of hard to put into a perfect scale as to where we are within the book of Judges, because Sam and Rahab have Boaz, but Boaz seems to have been perfectly content being a bachelor for a long time. And here this young woman has come to him and said, I want to marry you. And he says, well, who can turn down an offer like that? And he says, you just lie back down and I'll tell you what to do. And so he goes and he sits in the gates, because that's where judgments are made. And he brings to himself 10 elders, because that's the way that judgments are made. And then he calls up the nearest kinsman and he says to him, we need to take care of Elimelech's estate. Naomi has come home, and we need to take care of his estate in Mahlon and Chilions. And the guy says, okay, I'll do it. I'll redeem them. And what he meant by that was, I will take over their land, however much it is that they own. And Boaz says, okay, that's fine, but understand that Ruth then becomes your wife as well. And he says, I can't do that. He says, I have a wife. He says, I have children. Now, that wouldn't have disqualified him from honoring the Levirate law, or being one that keeps the Levirate law, because we understand the law of the Jews. They were able to marry a second or a third or a fourth. How many wives did David and Solomon have? You remember all that. But anyways, he says, I can't do that. That will ruin the inheritance for my children. You know what he's doing? He has already divided up his inheritance within his mind amongst the children that he has had. And then he thinks, and now I'm going to marry this young woman? And how fertile is she? How many children am I going to have by her? And all of a sudden that inheritance in his mind is getting split up more so than what he wants to. And he says, I can't do that. And so he relinquishes the right, and he becomes the one who removes the sandal. Again, another thing that's not a part of our culture that seems to be odd, but that's what they did in order to say, I am not the one that's going to fulfill that Levirate law. And then Boaz takes that sandal and he says, I am the one. And then what happens? There's a marriage and there are blessings. And they come to Naomi, and this is in chapter 4, and they say, you know what, Naomi? Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. Wow. This woman who was without hope, this embittered widow, now dawdles, for what is all practical purposes, a son. Now, I don't know what it means whenever it says that she was his nurse. I don't know what all that implies, but I do know that it means that that Levirate law, that brotherly law had been fulfilled. And as Boaz marries Ruth, then he has made progeny for Mahlon, but he has also stepped up the ladder, and Naomi becomes blessed as well. And Obed has Jesse, and Jesse has David, and David has Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived. You see, in that is a little bit of a sad part of this story, because if you look a little further down the line in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 7, you find out that the great-great-grandson of Ruth, Solomon, brings back into Israel the god of the Moabites, Chemosh. Oh, Solomon. And you know, if Ruth was alive at that time, which I don't think she is by the time of Solomon, but if she was at that time, wouldn't that have broke her heart to think that her great-great-grandson would have brought a foreign god of sexual impurity and of human sacrifice back into the city of Jerusalem? But it just tells us, doesn't it? It just reminds us that we need to pledge our love and to keep our promises. Because Solomon had pledged his love to God, but then what was it that drew him astray? It was his many foreign wives and their love for idolatry that had led him astray. Naomi pledged her love to God, but because of circumstances, because of death within the family, that had hardened her heart to the point where she was ready to reject God, though she might not have realized it. Call me Mara, for the Lord has afflicted me. She was blaming him. Would we ever go there? Yeah, man, within the story of Ruth, there really is just a composite of who we are as humans, of those who are faithful that can harden and who can turn away from God, but also of the outsider, of the foreigner, of the heathen who can come to God and glory within his wisdom and within his love and his provision. Even the Redeemer, you have the redeeming kinsman with Boaz who steps up and even in his old age does exactly what the Lord desires of him. Friend of God, that's a description that is given of Abraham. It says that because he obeyed God's commandment, he was called a friend of God. I think that title belongs to Ruth as well, don't you? What have you done for friendship? Pledge your love to Christ. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ, you are all children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. Pledge your love to him and keep your promises to him as well. As we stand and as we sing.